So in this video, I'm going to show you how to take the character turnarounds that you did in the previous step and clean them up. By cleaning up your characters, what I mean is we're going to have much more cleaner lines instead of the rough, sketchy lines that we have right now. And we're going to give our character a much more graphic look to it. And we're going to do this by using a mix of the pen tool as well as the brush tool. On average, the cleanup process usually takes twice as long as the rough drawing, and this is because of the extra precision that the drawings are required to complete. Alright, let's start cleaning up these drawings. Make sure that all your poses are laid out clearly before you, and let's lower the opacity of all these layers, maybe to about 30% so that they're just visible. And we're going to use our pen tool to give us these clean outlines. Click P on your keyboard or hit the pen tool on the toolbar on the left, and let's start outlining our character. Make sure that your brushes are at full opacity and are clearly round with no blurred edges. This is going to be what the outline of your character is going to look like when you're done using the pen tool. Experiment with this to see if you're happy with the line thickness and what exactly you're looking for. Once you're happy with your brush size, go back to the pen tool and then hit right click when you're done with your shape. Then select stroke path. Make sure that the brush option is selected. And now you've essentially created a cleaned up version of your character with a mix of the brush and the pen tool. Remember to work on a new layer each time so that you're not drawing directly on the layer that you have your sketch on. And the reason I just don't draw in using the brush and I use the pen tool, it's because it gives me a nice clean line right away instead of me having to kind of go in over and over again and draw in this clean brush stroke. This is a much more efficient way of getting it done. Now, using different layers, let's retrace and draw everything up in clean lines. Use the same process over and over again. Remember to refer to your sketch as a template and a guideline when you're redrawing. Now, instead of constantly hitting right-click and stroke path brush to get your cleaned up lines, you can also create an action which will speed up this process. If you open up the Actions window, you can basically record a process and then add a keyboard shortcut to it that will speed this up. You can actually create your own keyboard shortcut under Edit Keyboard Shortcuts to basically play the same action over and over again for you. It's actually very cool and easy, and I use it often. I have set up Command or Control F on my keyboard to replicate this process. Now I'm using a different size brush stroke width for the character. So on the outside I'm using only about 7 point width, and on the inside for the thinner lines I'm using about a 4 point width. Now I'm still using my blue guidelines as often as possible. For now I had hidden them, but I made them visible so that I can continue outlining this character. I often hide the sketch below to see what my outline would look like without the sketch, just to make sure that the cleaned up version is resonating well and clearly, and I'm not losing any information in this process. When creating her eyes, I want to use a slightly bolder width for my brush, and I also want to make sure that her eyes look as menacing as I want them to. Remember, she is a villain after all. Now when creating her pupil, I've created it on a separate layer using the circle shape tool. And this way I can kind of make it an oval shape if I want. I can make it rounder, and because it's on a new layer, I can kind of rotate it around to make sure that I get the right shape that I'm looking for. Again, I've used a much thicker brush to create her eyelashes, and I'm also going to kind of color in her eye to make it very bold and dynamic. I want to bring as much attention as possible to her eyes in this case. Now I've added in a little bit of her hair in the front. I think it's kind of cute and breaks up the silhouette a bit and makes the shape a little more interesting. Now when creating the shape for her eye patch, I used the same process as I did with the pen tool, but instead of hitting stroke path, I actually hit make selection. This ends up creating a selection around where the pen tool was. And now I use the paint bucket and fill in that entire shape with the gray color. I'm adding in all the fine details using a much thinner brush in this case. I don't want this information to overpower the outline and the silhouette that I've created of her shape. Now I'm loosely kind of drawing in the small details from the wires in her backpack. I'm just using the brush tool in this case because they're small in size and they're very quick strokes, so I don't really need the pen tool at this moment. I'm going to merge all the layers that I did this outline in so that everything will finally be in one layer once I'm done. You can do this by selecting all the layers and then hitting Command E or Control E on your keyboard. You can shift select all the layers in your layers window and then combine them together. Or you can even do it by going to Edit and Copy Merged. And now let's hide our rough sketch layer so that we can admire our outline for a moment. Looks pretty nice, doesn't it? And now let's move on to doing the outline and cleanup for our front pose. I'm going to use the exact same process that I used for my 3/4 pose, and I'm also going to work in new layers each time in case I make any mistakes. And once I'm finally happy with my entire outline, I'm going to basically do Command E or Control E on my keyboard to merge all those layers together. And now remember, when you're working on the front pose, replicate and mirror each side as much as you can. You don't have to do twice the work. Just do one side and then duplicate that layer and then go to Edit, Flip Horizontal, and that way you have a mirror image of your outline. Let's start by drawing the helmet in first, and of course I'm using the help of my blue guidelines. I haven't deleted that layer yet. This is really going to help me figure out how to maintain the same proportions throughout this entire sketch. Now, as I'm doing one side of the outline, I'm dragging and dropping that layer onto the new layers icon in the layers window, and this is essentially creating a duplicate layer. Then of course, again, I'm going to edit and flip horizontal, and I have the mirror image for my characters. I kind of used the warp tool again earlier to bend and kind of maneuver this shape around of the helmet. I want to kind of make sure that it reads just like our 3/4 view. Does it have the right folds where it needs to be? Is the information in the right place? I'm always thinking of this as I'm drawing. Now, instead of kind of drawing the eye shape again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my eye from my 3/4 drawing, and I'm going to kind of take the lasso tool and draw around it and copy just that shape. And I'm going to drag it over to my front view. And I'm going to use the same eye shape for this. And I'm going to mirror it again. Of course, in this case, I don't really need to use that eye. It's just simply to give me an understanding of where that shape needs to be on the character. And again, to create the shape for the eye patch, I am using the pen tool, but in this case, instead of stroke path, I'm doing make selection and I'm filling in that shape with the paint bucket tool. I want to make sure that the eye patch kind of reads as it would in 3/4 view and in my front view. It should look clear and not too weird and out of place. Now I really like the round button nose that I've created in the front view. I'm going to duplicate this layer and I'm going to kind of add it back to the 3/4 view that I created. I want to have the same nose throughout. I think it really works for the character. Also, I've kind of changed her smile to a frown in the cleanup process. I think this makes her look more menacing. You're going to notice that I'm going to use a lot of the same shapes that I used in the 3/4 view in my front view. So again, taking the lasso tool, I'm going to kind of cut out the shape of the eyebrow and move it over to the front because I think it really works well both ways. And I did the same, of course, with the smile and with the nose. And now I'm going to start working on her spacesuit. Again, I'm just working on the left side and then I'm just mirroring everything on the right side. This is so that I maintain the same amount of consistency throughout my character, especially because since it's the front view, she can be as symmetrical as possible. Now I'm kind of drawing in the legs and using the transform tool to make sure that everything is in the right angle. Remember, I'm also using Command F, as I mentioned earlier, to replicate this action over and over again. You can set this keyboard shortcut on your own as well and make it whatever you want it to be. And again, hitting L on my keyboard, I'm going to kind of take the entire torso and legs together and spread them apart. I think her body should be a little bit wider in this case. And I also want her chest to be a little bit narrower. Playing around with it just to see what works, because in the cleaned up version, things tend to look differently than they did in your sketched version sometimes. You can continue to hide or keep the blue lines as you're drawing. If they're too distracting, I tend to kind of hide them as often as I can. But you know, by all means, leave them on at all times. That's perfectly fine. Whatever makes it easier for you to get your character done. And now let's kind of start drawing in her arm and her glove and also a front view of her ray gun. Remember to zoom in often to make sure that when your lines are overlapping, you don't have any parts that are kind of sticking out. Especially in your cleaned up version, you want to make sure everything looks as crisp and clean as possible. And now making sure that my arm is entirely on one layer, I'm going to mirror it to the other side. And I don't think I need to do many adjustments in this case, since there's nothing on her left arm. And I really like the shape of the ray gun that I created in my 3/4 view. So I'm going to again take the lasso tool, kind of cut out that shape, and I'm going to move it over to the front. And we're going to make a few adjustments here and there, but in general, I really like the shape of the gun as a whole, and I think I can use it for my front view as well, just with a few minor tweaks here and there. I also realized that the 3/4 view of my gun looks better for my front view, so I'm going to kind of make a few adjustments. I'm going to go back to the 3/4 again, and I'm going to add in her handle, and I'm going to make sure that it looks like her hand is actually holding the ray gun in this case, because it wasn't very clear. And you know, we're going to make sure that this gun is going to be different from when I do the side view as well. And again, just using my brush, I'm going to draw in the smaller details. I don't really need the pen tool in this case because the shapes are so small. Now I'm going to kind of redraw her leg in again since I erased it when I was drawing in the ray gun. Make sure that it is again on a new layer in case you make any mistakes and you want to kind of erase it back up again. And let's move back to our front view again and go back to painting in that ray gun. I'm kind of moving the gun back and forth to make sure that it's in the exact place that it needs to be, just like where the 3/4 view is, same height, same shape, and I'm kind of erasing out a little bits of the inside, and you know, adding in the same detail that I saw in the 3/4 view, I'm going to add it into the front view. And I'm going back and forth, you know, between the two views, making sure that everything is where it needs to be and maintaining that kind of proportion throughout. And again, I'm going to kind of draw in the smaller details with just my brush tool. Sometimes I do hold down the shift key so I make sure that I get that straight line when I'm drawing. Now again, I'm going to take the same exact shape as I did from my 3/4 view of the pocket. Just going to use the lasso tool and kind of trace around it and move it over to my front view, mirror it to the other side. This again kind of maintains that really nice symmetrical aesthetic throughout the piece. I'm doing the exact same thing with the wires on her bag as well. Remember to make note of what your brush width is throughout the character. The outside was a much thicker width. The inside, when I'm adding in the minute details, are much thinner widths. Be sure to make a note of this so that otherwise it doesn't look too weird or too different from pose to pose. Remember to hide your sketch often just to make sure that the cleaned up version looks good. And of course, let's not forget that we want to add in all the little details like on her knees and anything else that we might have forgotten. I'm going to use the same circle shape as I did for the 3/4 view for the screws in her helmet. I'm just going to kind of rotate them around so that it looks like it's coming in from a different direction. That's about it. And we're mostly done with our front pose. I'm just adding in all the final details. Kind of forgot to add in the badge in the 3/4 view, so I'm making sure that I have it on both sides of my character. And of course, if you're working in different layers, remember to merge all of those before you move on to working on the side pose. And now remember to lower the opacity and start a new layer, and let's start outlining it with our pen tool. I'm going to retrace the helmet from the 3/4 view and kind of use the same shape as I did and move it over to the side view. I'm going to redraw the shape of the eye in this case because it is from the side and it won't be the same or the exact same as it is in the 3/4 view. Now using the same brush width as I did for the eyelashes in the 3/4 view, I'm going to replicate that and do it in the side view. And now to create the eyelid, I'm going to use the same process that I did for the eye patch, just kind of using the pen tool to go around it, right click and selection, and fill it with the paint bucket tool. And now kind of recreating the same eye shape that I did in the 3/4 view, I'm going to place it into my side view and a little more toward the right so that it kind of looks like she's looking ahead. And now using the blue lines as my guideline, I'm going to draw in that little window in her helmet. And of course, let's use the same button nose that we did in the 3/4 view and the front view, and we'll kind of replicate it and move it over to the side view and erase it out, you know, so that it doesn't look like it's just stuck on there. It looks like it's a part of her face. I want to use the same hair shape that I did in my 3/4 view, and I simply do this by retracing it out on a new layer, of course, and then dragging it over to my side view and placing it by her hair. Remember to hold down the shift key when you kind of drag these shapes back and forth, because what that does is it keeps it in the same place throughout. You can't like move it around, you know, when you have the shift key held. It's very handy. And now let's start working on her torso and her spacesuit. And I'm going to start drawing in her arm in the side view. I want to make sure that it kind of maintains the same consistency as I did in my front and my 3/4 view. And now I'm going to start adding in her backpack. I'm probably going to give this a little more love since this is the most of the backpack that we're seeing. And of course, let's add in her straps. I'm going to use a slightly thinner brush width in this case, since it's not like a major detail of the character. And of course, let's start drawing in the big wires from her backpack to her helmet. I don't think that my sketch had kind of drawn it in the right place, so I'm going to move it a little higher to make sure that it looks the same as it does in my 3/4 and my front view. Now I want to add in the X-ray gun. What I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate the entire layer of my 3/4 character. I drag this down into the new layer icon, and now I have a similar duplicate layer. I'm going to erase out everything but the ray gun and then drag it over to my side view. Of course, I'm going to make a few tweaks so that it looks like it's properly from the side view and not, again, just from the 3/4 view. And I'm going to make sure that the hand looks like it's actually holding the gun as well. You know, you can kind of erase out and draw in using the pen or the brush tool. And of course, don't forget to add in the small details like the knee pads and the pockets. Again, I'm just using the lasso tool and outlining the shape from the 3/4 view and holding down the shift key, dragging it back over there, and then just merging it back down. And you know, again, using the same thin line, I'm going to just use the brush tool and just draw in the small details. Sometimes I use the pen, sometimes I don't use the pen. It just depends on the situation in this case. And similarly, what I did with the hair, I'm also going to do with her eyebrow. I'm going to kind of outline it and drag it over to the side. Now, I just realized I made a bit of a mistake. I kind of did her side view with her face sticking out, so it doesn't look like there's a glass on her helmet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the lasso tool and just outline the part of her face and just move it in more to the left, and then I'm going to draw in the outline of the glass. And of course, not to forget her little hair swirl, I'm going to use the transform tool or Command or Control T on my keyboard and kind of adjust the shape on her head so that it reads clearly. And of course, now we can hide the back of the sketch and add in any more small details that we want. I think it looks pretty cool so far. And now let's just start adding in the final details for the side pose, and we can wrap up and move over to the next pose. Now we're going to start working on the 3/4 back view of our character. We can use the same shape as we did on the helmet in our 3/4 view. I'm going to use a lot of the same outlines as I did and the same processes as I did before. This one, of course, should be much faster because, you know, the more poses you do, the faster you're going to get as you keep doing them. Now I always keep my 3/4 view right next to the pose that I'm working on, but of course on the far left I have my front and my side view. I'm constantly referencing that now as I'm drawing in the ray gun. And now I'm going to use the pen tool and just redraw the hair in the 3/4 view. And I'm going to use pretty much the same shape with just a slightly thicker volume and put it on the back of the helmet. This again is going to hide a lot of the information, like the backpack and a little bit of her torso as well. Now I'm adding in the little window on her helmet. Of course, this time be sure to make sure that the glass is on the outside and it looks like her face is on the inside. And now let's start adding in the outline of her legs and her torso, as well as her boots. Sometimes when using the pen tool, if I create a shape that I'm not happy with, what I usually do is just right there and then take the transform tool and adjust that shape immediately. You can just take your lasso tool, outline that little part, and then with Command or Control T, just shift up and down, side to side to make sure that your shape is correct. Again, I'm zooming in constantly to make sure that all my lines are clean and that nothing is overlapping. And again, remember to just hold down the Shift key and kind of draw lines back and forth between your poses to make sure that everything is where it needs to be. And of course, don't forget to add in the small details with a thinner brush line as well. And now on a new layer, remember to start adding in the wire as well as the small details in her helmet. Again, I'm using the same shape of the screws on our helmet as I did in the previous poses, but I'm just using the transform tool to kind of rotate them around so that they look like they're in the same position but in a different direction. This just maintains the consistency. And now, of course, we're adding in the ray gun. I'm going to kind of trace out the basic outline of it, but not the handle or any other detail. And then I'm going to move it over to my 3/4 back pose. And now I'm going to start drawing in the other detail that I need to. I like that the barrel of the gun is just a thin line with a little triangle at the end. I think it'll look easy to kind of animate from all sides if it's the same shape. So I'm just going to use the exact same thing and drag it over to the other side. Now using my brush tool, I'm just going to kind of loosely draw in the small details. Also, sometimes I do hold down Shift to make sure that the lines are straight. We're pretty much done with the 3/4 back pose. It was much faster, as you can tell. And I'm just going to hide the sketch and we're going to move on. And now let's move on to our final pose, the back of our character. Again, I'm going to use a similar process as I did with the rough sketch. I'm going to essentially duplicate the front view. I'm going to erase out the inside and I'm going to create a shell for the outside. This is much faster and a much easier way to do this instead of having to redraw the whole thing again. Let's start adding in the detail on the helmet. Of course, a lot of it will be hidden once the hair comes, but this way at least I can make sure that it's symmetrical. And of course, I'm going to outline the exact same hair as I did in the previous poses, in my side pose, in my 3/4 pose, and we're going to take over the same hair shape and move it to the back and just adjust it accordingly so that it looks appropriate, and keep the volume fuller as well. And now let's erase out any unnecessary detail hidden under her hair, as well as her helmet and her backpack. And of course, now since this is the back pose, remember to kind of erase out her torso, and that to add in the correct detail, like we don't need to add in her chest area anymore, just kind of fill it in with the backpack and the back of the arm. And of course, be sure to make sure that the character is mirrored accordingly so that the ray gun is on the right. And let's extend out this wiring from the helmet to the backpack. Of course, in the front view it was hidden, and now since we're doing the back view, we can kind of go in there and add in that detail. And of course, using the brush tool, I'm very loosely just drawing in these small lines. And of course, since I'm going to be keeping my character as symmetrical as possible, be sure to duplicate this entire layer. And what I'm going to do is I want to basically add the wiring and the cabling on the other side. And although we're not going to see much detail of it, I want to make sure that all the exact information is there. So I'm just going to erase out everything but that small little portion of wire that's peeking behind her hair. And of course, now we're going to add in the main component of the character, her X-ray gun. Of course, in this case, we're going to add in the back details of this gun. Of course, I use the transform tool to make sure that everything is in the right shapes that I need it to be. This is, of course, if when I drew it with my pen tool, it didn't read as clearly. And we're done. Let's take a moment to appreciate all the poses and turnarounds that we did for our character. Looks pretty cool, doesn't it? Now that we're finally done with our cleanup, which was a very long process, we're going to move into a more fun and quicker step, the color part of it. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to take the 3/4 pose that we did, which was also your main pose for your character, and we're just going to add a light layer of color to it.